So one of the most remarkable aspects of the internet is the way that being open about the projects we're working on can bring interesting new opportunities into our lives. So our next speaker, Brendan Scott, discovered this firsthand when Wiley expressed interest in turning his Python for Kids blogging project into a published book. And he's here today to provide an inside view of that process.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming along. This is about writing this book, Python for Kids. It doesn't exist as yet. It's due to come out, officially it's due to come out tomorrow, or it was due to come out tomorrow in the States, but that is now going to be mid-August or so. There are sample chapters at the front here if anybody is interested. Gives you some idea about the layout of the book. You can pick one up. So, what is it? It's a book for kids. It's about learning Python. And it's a book that I wrote over the last summer. It's aimed at young children, 10 and up, and I think 10 is probably the lowest that you would go. You'd have to be a motivated child to do the work at age 10. It's published by Wiley, blah, blah, blah. I've just said all that, so I don't need to talk about it anymore. Why did I write it? Well, I wrote it because I love Python and I really wanted to share that love with everybody. That and the fact that someone asked me whether I would be kind enough to share my love with other people. And those people were Wiley. They had seen a blog that I had started writing about 4 or 5 years ago called Python for Kids. And not only did they see the blog and think, oh gee, that's fantastic, they have also noticed that there are a lot of sales in this area of coding for kids, whether it's Python or Ruby or whatever. And so they were looking for somebody who could write a book to fill their For Dummies stable. And of course, the zeitgeist seems to be that everybody thinks that children should be learning to code. So what was involved? I'd break it down into 3 separate sections. Engagement, design of the curriculum, and the execution, which is the writing. And the engagement is actually getting in contact with Wiley, or them getting in contact with me, and getting to a point where I could actually feel confident that I could start writing the book and not be wasting my time. And these stages basically went like that. And so that's a period of roughly 12 months. Of those 12 months, 3 of them were sort of lost because the initial fellow that contacted me from Wiley left the company, and apparently didn't tell anybody else that this project had started or was about to start or anything. So the second phase was another 3 months where they contacted me again and said, oh, are you still interested in writing the book? And I said, yes, and then we took off. And that period of 3 months was actually a lot longer than I wanted it to be. And the reason it was a lot longer was because, and I'll talk about this again a little bit later, Wiley was really interested in a detailed table of contents for the book. And while it was easy to put together a high-level project strategy, a high level of the statement of the projects which were involved, the actual detail was difficult for reasons that I'll explain later. There was another period which was contract negotiations, which held me up forever, partly because I didn't want to do them. I kept pushing them off, and partly because it's genuinely difficult to sort the contract out. And I did most of the drafting of the content for the book within a period of about 4 or 5 weeks, over January and February this year. And since that time, I've been into these 2 final phases, reviewing, editing, and proofing, about which I'll speak. Oh, I've told you that. Okay, so the only thing I wanted to mention here is that the editing involves 2 separate sets of editing, a technical review and an editorial review. And at the end, there's a proofing step. Now, of all of that, I found the hardest thing to do was designing the curriculum for what exactly was I going to cover in this book. And I did, it was the hardest part of the process. As I said, Wiley wanted have a detailed list of what I was going to do. So if I said I was going to do a guessing game, they wanted me to put all of the steps in the guessing game that I would be doing. But the problem was, in order to do that, I needed to know what all those steps would be, and that sort of meant I needed to have the code effectively. I needed to have written the project in order to get that that table of contents, that level of detail. And it's partly affected by the fact that I wanted to do a tutorial-driven book. And so, because it's a tutorial, each of the projects is like a journey, where you're going down this journey and you're doing little different things along the road. And that means that you don't know what you've covered until you've actually covered it in terms of doing the drafting. So it turned out that the table of contents, sort of the project level table of contents, was effectively what we used, and then the more detailed level of the sections had to be filled in after the fact. So when I was planning the curriculum, or the things that I was going to be covering in the book, these were the main things that I was concerned with. Learning objectives, what exactly did I want to cover? And I was pretty, I shot pretty high in the learning objectives, and I had to wind it back afterwards. I also wanted to provide motivations for the reader. So I was trying to find things to justify everything that I did. So I didn't want any element of the book to just fall out of heaven and say, look, people do this for no particular reason. And I was also driven by a couple of principles, which I will cover in a second. So what are the learning outcomes I want to look for? Well, basically I just wanted to do everything. And I tried my best to get all of the key concepts into the book. Now, the trouble with getting all of those key concepts into the book is that for doing any one of those concepts, you have to do it really, really slowly. And so where it ends up, or what gives, is the level of exhaustiveness that I went to in the details. So if I came up and I discussed a string object, for example, or a list object, I didn't go through and list all of the methods that the lists have. I didn't go through everything that you can do with a list. I just said, this is, I put it in a context. You need a list to do this thing, but then I didn't go and tell them about everything else that you could possibly do with a list. And that actually, that approach actually I felt helped, because it meant that I wasn't getting bogged down in detail, trying to explain every last detail about things, because I figured that everyone would be bored out of their brains if I did that. And the other thing that gave was the book under the weight of the work, and there were just too many pages. And so some of the projects are not in the book, but they're sort of extensions which will be available online. So motivations, how did I find the motivations that I was looking for the content of the book? So the first thing that I was looking for was something that was a practical application. I wanted something which had some meaning. And that's actually quite difficult, because the capability of someone who's learning the projects is quite limited. And so the whole of, project 2, so you don't even get started, I didn't even start programming until project 2, is just hello world, and a couple of different variations on hello world, and put in a loop, and the sort of things that I used to do, when there was a department store and you walk past. Some time ago. I wanted to have some what I've called anchor motivations, and they're like the goal at the end of the tunnel, the light at the end of the tunnel, something sort of interesting you can do, you can look forward to. And the first one was a manipulator of Minecraft on a Raspberry Pi. So there's a library that allows you to do manipulate Minecraft worlds using Python. And there were a couple of other things, doing some stuff with a chess engine, because I thought it'd be cool for them to write their own chess game on top of this thing called Sunfish, and I also wanted to do some web scraping. But in the end, they were just too much, and so they were jettisoned. But the Minecraft component was kept. And so that anchor motivation is sort of like, well, that's where what you'll be able to do at the end of the book. And then every chapter, the book is broken into projects. And for each of the projects, there is a specific motivation. And so they're not necessarily very deep motivations, but they're things like doing a guessing game, converting that guessing game to use a function so that it's reproducible, doing an elite speaker, so changing some text into elite speak, those sorts of very easy to achieve things. And in the course of doing that, I was trying to map those. So I had my list of things that I wanted to cover, and then as I covered them in a project, I crossed them off the list to try and get everything done. And of all of those things, I found one thing was difficult to shoehorn, and that was file accessing. So that did end up going into a project on. There's a Caesar cipher project in there, and it went into that Caesar cipher project. So what were the principles that I was acting on when I was drafting the book? Number one was learn by doing. I mean, to me, that's got to be the most important thing about learning Python. You're not going to learn by reading, you need to learn by doing. And given that I'm writing a book and I'm not there with the person who's reading the book, that was actually really difficult. But I tried my best to inspire this learn by doing attitude. And in respect of that, the first two active projects, projects 2 and 3, are all on the interpreter, the command line, the interpreter, not on the command line. So I'm not even getting into file, saving things to a file yet. I'm just trying to get them to realise that if they type into the terminal, they'll get an instant response from Python. And on that, the editor had to keep telling me to explain to them what to do when explain in baby steps. This is actually what you type at the text. Type this at the text. When you see this, type this over and over and over again. So demonstrate mistakes as normal, and that's part of that. Get in and do it. Don't be worried about making mistakes. And also to make them use the introspection features. And that was also partly linked back to the fact that I wasn't covering everything in the book. I was only giving an access to, well, this is what you absolutely need in order to achieve this. But if you use, if you use dir on that object, you can find all these other things that you can then investigate. So I wanted to provide understanding and motivation, and I've spoken a little bit about motivation in the previous slides. But the thing that I wanted to say here was that everything that I didn't want to introduce any concept or any keyword or anything until I'd first explained it and also given a reason why it was there. And that was really, really difficult for the first couple of projects because you're sort of bootstrapping yourself in those first couple of projects. But as you get further into the book, it became easier. Age-appropriate vocabulary. So a lot of my words just got cut out. I did want to put in interesting words to break the monotony of the coding section, but I tried to keep those in sections where you didn't need to understand the meaning of the word in order to achieve something. And I also wanted the readers to understand that there's a broader community out there, and so Project 1, half of Project 1 was discussing, you can go out to the internet and look for answers on things. You can go to the Python documentation that's online. You can use the help features within Python. Practical decisions. Number 1 was the most difficult, and that is that the book's written targeting Python 2.7. And partly the motivation, there are a lot of motivations for that. The first was, my feeling was third-party libraries out there had better support for Python 2.7 than for Python 3. And in particular, the anchor project that I had chosen, which was the Minecraft Pi thing at the end, needs Python 2.7. So in a sense, that was the main influence on that. But also Python 2.7 is installed by default on Macintosh computers, and so that also meant that it was easier for those children to access the content. It's primarily command line interfaced rather than GUIs, and that's because I just thought it was too difficult to get onto the GUI stuff. Like too many supporting concepts were needed in order to get to the GUIs. It's not overly game focused in the sense that it's not focused on two-dimensional, three-dimensional games. There are, I guess you would call them command line games, but they're not. But they're also not very deep in terms of games. Like a guessing game is the level of the game that's in there. I wanted them to use the IDE to get them introduced to the concept of an IDE, but not the debugger component of it. Apparently there are problems setting breakpoints on Macs using that. TK-Inter and not Pygame, again because I thought Pygame you needed too much supporting infrastructure in order to get there. And the TK-Inter stuff is actually in the online projects, the last couple of projects. So how did I go about writing it? Well, you're given a Word template and they tell you to draft into it. And they give you a whole heap of styles. They say, this is our style, and we want you to apply it in these situations. When you have a piece of code where you have 70 characters, then you apply the code 80 style to it. If you want normal text, etc. And so that was done in the course of drafting. One of the difficult things was that diagrams are not inlined into the document, and so the diagram has to be in a separate file, and you have to reference that file by its file number. And if you decide you want to change the file name, or you want to reorganize the order of the screenshots, the diagrams that you're doing, technically you're supposed to redo the file names as well, which was really annoying, actually. And I drafted and coded the stuff in parallel, so as something worked, it got introduced into the text. Publishers have this thing called art, which gets included in the books. This is an example of art, which is a screenshot of the Python download page. The little lines coming out are called callouts, and I've discovered that you cannot do callouts on text. You can only do callouts on images, and so what I wanted to do was do callouts on Python code, but it was a problem because they won't do callouts on text. So in the end, I decided I didn't want to have images of code, like I wanted to have. I don't know whether you understand what I'm saying, but I wanted text there, not someone having taken a photo of the text and then putting that photo into the body of the document. So art is anything other than the text. When they gave me actually 7 pages of instructions about how to take screenshots, one of which was that I needed to use a screen resolution, not an image resolution. The screen itself had to be 1024 by 768, which was like, there's a time and place for 1024 by 768, and that time was the 1990s. So what I ended up doing was I wrote a program so on Windows you can automate key presses and mouse clicks and so forth, and so I just wrote a program to automate the typing of the code into a Python command line, and then taking of a screenshot of it and doing the few captions. The projects which involved art were much more time consuming, and that means screenshots of what's going on, much more time consuming than the ones which didn't have any art in them. Editing. Okay, so this is what happens after you've, my exquisite prose has gone off to the editors, and then at some time later they come back with lots of red line through it. Do this, do that, do something else. There are two editing stages, or there are two editing stages in the book. The first is the technical editor that checks. They check the sense of the text, but they also check whether the code that's in there works. And then there's just the normal editor, which checks the English of the text. But the editor also made suggestions about the sense that was being given by the text, the structure, whether one concept should come before the other. And in particular, they took the red line to a lot of my words and put simpler words in. So lots of simple words. There was overlap between these two editors in what they did, like they often both suggested things for readability. But my ability to communicate with the technical editor was quite limited, and so I had to get used to that. That was a little bit difficult. So the coding was all done on Linux, but tested on Windows and Macintosh. I used Subversion to keep track of versions, and I synced it to the text by just putting in an author's note into the body of the text. But the thing that I had to remember, and that you probably need to remember if you're going to do this, is that the master is what's in the document, not what's in the Subversion repository. Because when the people are reading the books, they're not going to the repository, they're going to the text which is in front of them in the book. And so all of the code testing involves just cutting and pasting from the document back into a command line. And because it was a tutorial style to the project, any changes to the code were much more difficult because you have a stream where the code starts here and then it ends here and it changes along the way. If you make a change here, then you've got to check everything else, all of the other versions. Proofing, they send me through some PDFs, I print them out and I scribble all over them. Code colours. Code colours, let's talk about tribulations. Okay, so I was in there working my little backside off, drafting these things, and all of a sudden they were telling me that I had too many pages. I thought I was just on track, but I actually had too many pages. They cut back, take things out, they said. Throw away that project that you've almost finished writing on the Sunfish chess engine. And it turned out what happened was that they'd changed the way they wanted to present the book, and that had meant that there was a different allocation of white space to the page, and that meant that each page which I wrote as a page before was now about 1 1/3 pages. And so I had this additional problem of actually spending effort removing stuff that I had put in. Code 80 means 80 characters, right? Well, that's what it said in the docs that they gave me. It turned out that code 80 was only 69 characters. And so that meant, and I discovered that only at the proofing stage. So all of the coding was done, and I had sort of avoided doing code continuation characters and all of that. And so I had to go back and find all of those lines which were over 69 characters. And most of the time I tried to restructure the code so that it was less than 69 characters. But in a couple I actually needed to do the code continuation characters, and that meant that I had to add extra paragraphs explaining what these new slashes are at the end of some of the lines. Syntax highlighting in the copy text. I discovered that this was a possibility. I just thought that would be great if you can have syntax highlighting in the body of the text that they're reading in the book. But apparently it was really difficult for them. For me, I can, just colour the font and it's fine. Can't you just print it out with the coloured font? No, apparently it's very difficult for some reason. It has to be done manually. And so all of the syntax highlighting I had to check manually when it came back in proofing. that came as a big surprise to me. A couple of other tribulations which are not that important. So throughout the book, I'm trying to link back to the Monty Python basis of Python. That's how it was named, and so I've put little asides in there explaining some things which happen in. They do that. Some of their movies are The Life of Brian and The Meaning of Life, and I forgot the other one. Thank you. That's the most important one. And the comment comes back to me from the editor. Oh, by the way, The Life of Brian is rated R in the US, so we have to cut that out. So there's no reference to The Life of Brian in the book. And the other thing was I tried to include things like "oh my God" in there, but because that has a religious connotation, it was considered to be not politically correct, and so those sorts of references were also taken out. So I had a really good time writing the book. It took a lot longer than I expected it to, and it's still not finished. In particular, I have to go and do some review of the online chapters. But the online chapters, I've got more time to do because I don't have to get printed. The time commitment, well, as I said, was a lot longer than I expected it to be, both in terms of my actual time that I had to do, but also when it was going to be finished. So I expected it to be finished in February, and it's still going. And there were issues with the formatting which I was unable to control, and which caused me. That's part of the reason why the time commitment was so much. So if you're thinking about doing anything along these lines, I hope that that's provided you with some help. And if not, if you don't feel like doing that, go and check the book out when it gets published, and let me know any feedback you have. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Anybody thinking of writing a book? It's quite interesting.
Hi, have you tested your Python for Kids on any actual kids yet?
Yes. Well, and part of, so the book is inspired by a blog, and while nothing was copied from the blog, it was all, it follows the same similar sort of structure. The technical editor as well tried them out. Part of what one of her day jobs is as a classroom teacher, and so she was also trying it out on the kids.
One question from me. Could you say a bit more about the origins of the blog itself?
Well, yeah, my son who's hiding up the back, I thought I would like him to learn how to code in Python, and so I just started putting comments on. I started a blog, asked him to do the exercises that I was putting on the blog. You can go and check it out, and you can see the first blog entry is just, it's just like range 10 or something, right? And the point of it all is just one step at a time, but I don't want to overwhelm them with details. But also, if you check the blog, sometimes I just have a chat about something that's different and that might be relevant to their lives. And so I didn't want the book, and I don't want coding to be something which is separate from your existence, your reality. So anyway, the blog has been going for about 5 years. It gets about 1,000 unique visits a week or so, and I haven't actually updated it for a year or so now, but I'll be starting to do that in the next couple of weeks.
So I'm interested because I know you from your legal work, which is very different to this. How did you fit in your extremely busy day job with this as well?
Well, so if I can go back here, this section, December to January or December to February, that was my time off. That was just, I got some time, I want to make some use of it. And the difficult thing was aligning the stars so that they gave me the go-ahead in order to make use of that time. And actually, the truth is I started writing in December, and I assumed that if I couldn't pull the contract off, then I would just go and self-publish it, because I had a window of opportunity from January to February. But that period from February to now has been quite challenging. Yeah. And just on that, it's quite challenging because this review and editing bit is actually quite a big time commitment. You know, it's probably 20–30% of the original drafting time. Sorry.
What was the motivation for the Anchor project using Minecraft Pi?
What was the, I'm sorry?
The motivation for using Minecraft Pi as your Anchor project?
Well, because it's a bit different. It involves them using a piece of hardware, which is a little bit, it's sort of out there a little bit, but it's entirely within their capacity, them or their parents, to A, buy, and B, put together. And once you've done that, it comes, Minecraft is already there, and the Minecraft Pi library is also already there. And so it just seemed like a fun little thing that they could do. And so what the idea is that they can, it builds a castle, and so they can change, you know, the size and shape of the castle if they want to. But it also allows them to, you know, just wipe out a whole, so part of building the castle is you've got to clear some ground, and so they can wipe out a whole area. I mean, the main motivation is Minecraft has so much mind share, and it has a lot of mind share with that level of child, and if they can do it, then they're empowered to do something within that Minecraft environment, which I think, you know, is something they can brag to their friends about pretty easily. So that's sort of, you know, that's the threads of the motivations that were going through my mind. I mean, on the negative side, it broke one principle, which was that I wanted everything to be simple, because setting up a Raspberry Pi is not simple, and it is something that they're probably going to need to have a responsible adult to do. But once it's up and running, everything else they should be able to do.
Thank you, Brendan.
All right, thank you.